The police investigate crime, the courts decide guilt, and the government, at least in theory, plays by rules the public can see. But in the mid-20th century, inside the United States, a different kind of machine operated in secret. Not a machine designed to arrest bank robbers, not a machine designed to stop espionage, a machine designed to manage politics. It had a name that sounds clinical, almost bureaucratic. COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program. And the most important thing to understand about COINTELPRO is this: it wasn't just watching, it was interfering. It wasn't merely gathering information, it was actively sabotaging movements the government didn't like. And when you say that out loud, the story stops being about surveillance. It becomes something darker, because surveillance is passive. COINTELPRO was a weapon used against Americans. And it raises a question that never really goes away. When the government decides a political movement is dangerous, what is it willing to do behind closed doors to stop it? Before we talk about another corrupt shitstorm the American government created for itself, please subscribe to our channel, especially if you're into history. We release a new history video every other week. Now sit back, dim the lights, and shut your curtains, because the FBI is probably watching. It's time to talk about that one time the FBI was a bastard to we the people. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the era that gave it oxygen. After World War II, the United States entered a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. Not just a struggle over territory, but a struggle over ideology. And in that mindset, ideas weren't just opinions. Ideas were threats. The fear wasn't only that a spy might steal secrets. The fear was that an internal enemy might infect the country from within. Communism, in particular, wasn't treated like a rival philosophy. It was treated like a plague. And when a government convinces itself that it's facing an invisible ideological enemy, it starts looking at dissent differently. Not as disagreement, but as infiltration. Not as protest, but as sabotage. In that atmosphere, the FBI launched COINTELPRO in 1956, initially focusing on the Communist Party. But that was only the beginning. Because once you build a machine that can secretly disrupt political groups, the definition of dangerous has a way of expanding. So what was COINTELPRO, practically? Think of it as a toolkit, not a set of laws, not a public policy, a covert playbook. The goal wasn't simply to know what groups were doing. The goal was to break them, to fracture organizations from within, to ruin reputations, to trigger paranoia, to isolate leaders, to turn allies into enemies. Sometimes the methods were simple. Infiltration, placing informants inside groups, reporting back, steering decisions, feeding suspicion. Psychological warfare, anonymous letters, rumors, forged documents, accusations designed to ignite internal conflict. Media manipulation, nudging narratives, guiding public perception, ensuring the public saw a movement as dangerous or ridiculous. Legal harassment, pressure campaigns that weren't about winning in court, but about draining time, money, and energy. And the effect was cumulative. Even when a group wasn't broken in one dramatic moment, it could be exhausted, disorganized, distrustful, fractured. A movement can survive a bad headline. It's much harder to survive when it can't trust itself. Now, here's where COINTELPRO becomes more than a Cold War artifact, because it didn't stay narrowly focused. Over time, it expanded into programs aimed at what the government called subversive groups. That included targets on the left, civil rights activists, anti-war organizers, New Left student groups. It also included targets on the far right, including violent white supremacist organizations. And that's an important nuance. This wasn't simply the FBI hated one political side. This was deeper. COINTELPRO was a method, an approach, a belief that covert disruption could be used as a tool of domestic stability. And the moment a government believes that, you've crossed a line. Because now the state is no longer only enforcing laws, it's shaping society in secret. And when that happens, the public can't debate it, because the public doesn't even know it's occurring. So let's talk about what it looks like when this machine turns toward the center of American life. Because there is a moment in the COINTELPRO story that makes a lot of people stop and say, wait, that's the government? That moment often revolves around Martin Luther King Jr. By the early 1960s, King was one of the most visible civil rights leaders in the country. He wasn't just organizing protests, he was shaping the moral narrative of America. And in the eyes of certain officials, that made him dangerous. Not because he was committing crimes, but because he was effective. COINTELPRO tactics aimed at King moved beyond observation and into personal attack. The logic was brutal. If you can't defeat the message, destroy the messenger. And that's the heart of the program. COINTELPRO didn't try to win a public argument. It tried to collapse a movement by targeting its human points of failure: shame, fear, distrust, isolation. If you can convince people a leader is morally compromised, politically toxic, or privately weak, you don't need to defeat their ideas. You just need to make people step away. And it's not hard to see how that becomes a recipe for abuse. Because once you normalize secret sabotage as a government tool, who decides which leaders deserve it? Who decides which movements are too dangerous to exist? Now shift to another chapter of the 1960s, the rise of Black Power organizations, including the Black Panther Party. To many Americans at the time, the Panthers were controversial, often portrayed as militant, confrontational, radical. But they were also community organizers. They ran programs. They built local influence. They created a political identity that frightened people in power. And COINTELPRO treated that kind of organization as something to neutralize, not debate, not monitor, neutralize. One of the most effective ways to weaken any group, especially one under pressure, is to turn it inward. If you can spark rivalries between leaders, if you can plant suspicion, if you can make members wonder who's real and who's an informant, you create a self-destruct mechanism. You don't need to shut the group down from the outside. You let it tear itself apart. And even if the group survives, the damage spreads. Allies grow cautious. Supporters hesitate. Potential recruits stay away. the movement's momentum slows. And in politics, momentum is oxygen. Take it away, and everything becomes harder. And this didn't only hit civil rights groups. It hit anti-war movements and student activism, too. By the late 1960s, the United States was tearing itself apart over Vietnam. Protests expanded. Campuses became battlegrounds. And to many officials, protest wasn't a democratic safety valve. It was a threat to social order. COINTELPRO's approach, again, was disruption. Break coalitions, sow distrust between factions, turn public opinion against organizers. And the result was a country where political engagement could come with a hidden cost. Not just surveillance, not just a file, but a covert effort to make your movement fail. That's a different kind of power. So how did the public learn any of this? Not through transparency, not through a routine audit, not because the system suddenly developed a conscience. In March of 1971, a small group of activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. They stole documents. And then they did something that sounds almost unbelievable now. They mailed those documents to journalists and public figures. And in those papers, the words appeared, COINTELPRO. It was a crack in the wall. Because now the program wasn't rumor. It wasn't suspicion. It was written down. It was real. And for the government, that kind of exposure is catastrophic. Because COINTELPRO didn't survive public scrutiny. It could only survive in the dark. Officially, COINTELPRO was ended in 1971. But the deeper question was only beginning. What else had been done? How widespread was it? How many lives had been disrupted, destroyed, or redirected by a secret program that most Americans didn't even know existed? The reckoning arrived a few years later, in the mid-1970s, when the U.S. Senate launched major investigations into intelligence abuses, most famously through what's often called the Church Committee. This is the point where the story becomes undeniable, because now you have official hearings, official findings, and a public record acknowledging that intelligence agencies, including the FBI, had crossed lines. The committee's work exposed a pattern. Secret operations aimed at domestic political activity, justified under broad claims of national security. And this is where you can feel the American contradiction. On one hand, the government argues it needs tools to protect the country. On the other hand, the public learns those tools were used not only against foreign threats, but against Americans. People organizing, people protesting, people trying to reshape society. In other words, democracy. And that forces a question that cuts straight through the story. If you can secretly sabotage political movements, what does citizenship even mean? Because citizenship is supposed to include the right to participate, to argue, to organize, to protest, to try to change the country without the country secretly trying to break you. Now, it's tempting to end this story with a clean moral arc. COINTELPRO was exposed. COINTELPRO ended. Investigations happened. Reforms followed. And yes, there were reforms. There were new rules, new oversight, new awareness. But history is rarely that tidy. Because even if one specific program ends, the logic that created it doesn't vanish. The logic was simple. Some movements are too dangerous to be allowed to grow. And if you believe that, you start looking for ways to control those movements, quietly, plausibly, deniably. COINTELPRO is infamous not only because of what it did, but because it showed what a government can do when it decides the political battlefield is a security problem. And once you know that, you can't unknow it. So what is COINTELPRO in the end? It's a historical program with a start date, 1956, and an official end date, 1971. It's a list of targets and tactics, a folder of memos and operations. But it's also something bigger. It's a warning that the line between law enforcement and political power can blur, that a government can treat dissent like an enemy's system to be disrupted, and that the most frightening form of power is the kind you don't know is being used. Because you can fight a policy you can see, you can argue against laws, you can vote, you can organize, but you can't debate a covert operation you don't even know exists. That's why COINTELPRO still matters. Not because we're trapped in the 1960s, but because it asks a question that every democracy eventually has to answer. When the government is afraid, what is it allowed to do to its own people? And maybe the hardest part of the story is this. COINTELPRO didn't end because Americans voted it out. It didn't end because it was rejected in open debate. It ended because it was exposed. It was dragged into the light. And for a machine like that, light is the one thing it can't survive. Because when the public sees the weapon, the public starts asking who it was aimed at and who might be next. Thanks for watching. So what do you think? Did the government do what it needed to do to save the country from radical ideas? Or were they being a bunch of dicks? Just a bunch of dicks in a bag, like some sort of bag of dicks, dicking people off. Sound off in the comments below. Subscribe for more content, and please like the video if you enjoyed it, as that will help spread this amazing content to others. Thanks again, and keep an eye out for dicks in the shadows. And I'll see you next time.